Welcome, my friends. Welcome to our little show.
I've resigned myself right now that I'm sure to piss off a lot of people by going against established narrative. So be it. I don't necessarily like making people angry per se, but I figure the kind of people who would choose to be offended aren't really the people I'd want to associate with, and probably aren't too bright in any event. Well, let's get into it, shall we? Once upon a time, because that's how stories are supposed to start, I was at work, and by chance I was there when one of my associates approached me and my area manager to comment on the unacceptable behavior of another associate. In fact, this behavior was pretty egregious and self-evidently racially motivated. I was nearly floored when my area manager replied to the tune of, "No, she's black, she can't be racist. Prejudice maybe, but not racist." At that time, I wanted to keep my job, and in any case, I was so stunned by this blatant hypocrisy, double standard, and textbook example of applied racism that I didn't know what to say, but I doubt I was able to keep my jaw from dropping open. It should be pointed out, because I personally want to point this out, that this area manager, so far as I know, has never mistreated or engaged in discrimination against me personally in any way. Though we aren't using names, I wish to be perfectly clear on that. I don't know whether the self-evidently contradictory notion that the person is or is not capable of being racist based solely on the color of their skin to be hilarious or terrifying. All the more so because the words themselves came from the lips of someone who, so far as I can tell, is in all other ways a perfectly decent person, or at the least does an excellent job of pretending to be one. Nothing came of it so far as I know, but this was just their starting point. But where to go from here? Seriously, sometimes I truly do despair. Where do you start with a culture that promotes racism under the guise of fighting racism, and people who should damn well know better actually buying into it? I suppose let's start with diversity. Everywhere I've ever worked, diversity has been a buzzword. There are any number of diversity this and diversity that programs, but not once have I seen anything purporting to promote unity. This is a huge problem. You see, we humans are inherently tribal. We divide our world into us versus them. It isn't the patriarchy, it isn't some kind of ism, it isn't any color of supremacism, it's how our brains are wired. When you cheer for your team, whatever sport you may follow, you have divided your world into two halves: those who support your team and those who do not. They, whoever they may be, have become other, separate, apart from you, different. Whenever you identify with a group, any group, be it family, company, community, race, team, nation, people who drive Teslas, liberals and conservatives, you draw a line between people you see as like yourself and people you see as different. Suddenly, you and the people you identify with are on one side and everybody else is on another. Taking pride in your team and knowing it's better than any other team is no different in practice and principle than knowing your race is better than another. This isn't even necessarily a conscious thing. It's automatic. It's the way our brains work. Obviously, no one cares how fanatical you are about a sports team as long as you aren't violent. Putting your family first is a good thing. Patriotism is, and always has been, considered a virtue. And what's so wrong about being proud of the car you drive and that you can afford the $30,000 cost out of warranty battery replacement? Well, in itself, nothing. It is, after all, how our minds work. Most of us need a group to identify with, and when we encounter one that strikes our fancy, we insert ourselves into it without even consciously considering what we're doing. But it can get out of hand. It gets out of hand when you attack another team's supporters. It gets out of hand when you start calling everyone who supports another political party a terrorist. It gets out of hand when you think it's a good thing to deface, desecrate, and tear down monuments. It gets out of hand when you go around saying that everyone who doesn't want to be illegally forced into undergoing a medical procedure wants to kill people. It gets out of hand when you take out your frustrations about a certain virus that may have escaped from a bioweapons lab in a certain country on innocent people who look like they might have come from said country. And it gets out of hand when skin color becomes a primary determining factor when dealing with strangers. There are other examples, of course, but I want the length of this video to be measured in minutes, not days. This is the way our brains work, but it doesn't mean we aren't capable of doing a bit of reprogramming. Unfortunately, when we celebrate diversity, we are reinforcing our differences. We are making those divisions ever stronger, separating ourselves from our fellows with an ever-widening gulf that becomes just that much harder to build a bridge across. Me? I know a little about my ancestry, but I also know where I came from. It's a hospital in Richmond. It doesn't mean I don't have ancestors who accomplished great things or were persecuted in this way or that, but I am not them. They are long dead, and I neither owe them anything, nor do they pull my strings from beyond the grave. I can make my own choices. It may seem reasonable to take pride in a great ancestor. George Washington, Nikola Tesla, General Lee, George Washington Carver, Ferdinand Magellan, Albert Pike. Some people of a certain mindset might find villainous relations to be more pride-worthy. Joseph Stalin, Hillary Clinton, Attila the Hun, or Vlad the Impaler is always a popular choice. Whatever floats your boat, as the saying goes. Thing is, though, all those people, with the exception of Hillary, are dead and gone. No matter how near or distant a relation, they aren't you. Their crimes and accomplishments are not yours, and they've all gone to their reward, or to oblivion, depending on one's religious beliefs. Unless by some coincidence Hillary happens to be watching this video, none of these people are you. Get it? You are your own person. You make your own decisions. You face your own choices. Your ancestors and relatives didn't choose you any more than you are capable of choosing them. Of course, as I said, we are inherently tribal. It's built in, and we can't change it. We need our tribe, whatever we decide that is. It isn't good for us to be alone. But what we can do, what we do have control over, is the nature of which tribe we choose. This is where diversity is a problem. We already have a tendency to separate ourselves into tribes, and celebrating diversity as it is done by focusing on and celebrating our differences serves to disunite us. Yes, we are all different. I've always thought that our differences, our own individual strengths and weaknesses, kind of even out. and make us equal on the whole, even as we are clearly not in individual areas. Whether that's right or not, though, if we see ourselves primarily in terms of our differences, then how can we see ourselves as one? The ridiculous notion earlier that certain people can't be racist, for instance, that's the case in point. It's a doctrine that perpetuates and relies upon inequality, since it states that skin color makes someone incapable, therefore unalterably inferior, of a certain behavior. It doesn't just perpetuate differences based on racial lines, it's the metaphorical equivalent of a wedge. It can never unify. All it can do is divide, and it does so with unerring efficacy. The only way to combat racism, the only way to break down tribal divisions where none should be, is the doctrine of true equality. And this is not so easy as it sounds. You cannot force people to abandon their tribe. There is no mandate, no statute, no law or code of conduct you can impose on someone that will accomplish this. The more force you attempt to use, the more people resist. Many a tyrant has discovered this to his or her eventual ruin, and rightly so. You especially cannot do this in a socio-political unit that purports to place any value on individual freedom. So what, then, is the way forward? Well, as may be pointed out, I'm not actually any sort of expert. I'm just a person who has done a little thinking, and you are free to agree or disagree as you see fit. But it strikes me that this means I'm free to think without having to accept anyone else's doctrine or agenda. I don't have to conform to someone else's narrative. And as I see it, the first thing that needs to be done is to discard the culture of victimhood that seeks to divide society into victims and oppressors based solely and unalterably upon the color of someone's skin. Rare indeed is the person who, if one but goes back far enough, does not have a slave for an ancestor. And just as rare is the person who lacks an ancestor who enslaves someone else. The fact is, slavery goes all the way back to the very first caveman who picked up a club and indicated, by way of grunts and gestures, that another caveman without a club had better damn well do as he was told, or else. Today, though, at least in the United States, there is no one living who legally, either personally owned or was a slave, and God's willing there never will be again. There is no one who owes anything by virtue of their own actions, or is owed on this account. Our laws simply do not hold innocents responsible for another's actions. This doesn't mean that there are people who would be in a different position, most likely in a position on the other side of the planet, had their ancestors not been sold into slavery by, in most cases, and how's this for irony, by another tribe. But, facts of life, we're all born with the cards that were dealt. Or to put it another way, if you think life owes you anything, then I invite you. Go, stand upon a cliff perhaps, overlooking the sea, and shout out your appeal to God, to the wind, to the waters. Perhaps it will be granted. Who can say? But I shouldn't think it would be a good idea to hold your breath until that happens. I'm getting off topic, aren't I? The point is, we have to stop breaking society down into oppressors and victims. Society does indeed hold those things, but applying the label to strangers who one knows nothing about save the color of their skin, or their religion, or their politics, is both ridiculous and has the effect of striking that metaphorical wedge with a sledgehammer. However stupid and ridiculous, there will always be some foolish ear that hears, and some foolish minds who, in spite of all reason, believe. We must celebrate unity instead of diversity. We must stop being terrified of offending someone, and we must stop heeding those who choose to take unreasonable offense, especially on behalf of strangers. Of course, as I said, one can't mandate thoughts of individuals. One can't force people to use a specific criteria when choosing what they see as their tribe. It's counterproductive to try, and in any case, no one has that kind of legal authority. Perhaps the only thing that can be done on a government level with regard to racism is eliminating race, skin color, from all criteria. Remove it from all forms, do away with or alter any program that takes race into account in any way whatsoever. Do away with the notion of hate crimes. But there's another way. A way that's proven it will work when all other things fail. A terrible, terrible way. One needs an external enemy, or to fabricate an external enemy. That is enough of a threat to unite everyone. During World War II, we had such an enemy, the Axis powers. The far darker side of this is that so did the Nazis, who through a devious mix of truth and fiction made use of the Jews in just such a way in order to unify the German people. It is somewhat worrying that there are echoes of that same Nazi propaganda, both in word and in approach, in much of the anti-white people rhetoric that has turned up over the last couple of years. It won't work here. There are too many citizens who are too well armed, too secure in their rights. But once again, the result is division. There is always an ear that will hear, and a foolish mind that accepts what it is told, rather than thinking for itself. And the sledgehammer strikes upon the wedge once more. One wonders how many more strikes it will need to take before the log shatters. But who is saying these things? Where are they saying them? Well, mainstream media is partially to blame. Unfortunately, the purpose of any news organ is not actually to disseminate honest and impartial facts, though that is what they are supposed to do. But even a paper, a news channel, what have you, that wants to be honest is still there to make money. Happy, wholesome stories don't bring in the viewers. When you add in political bias, most major news sources, at least in the United States, have a decidedly leftward slant, but it was only in recent years that many abandoned altogether the pretense of impartiality. Many abandon honesty, and it is speculated that this is the reason that CNN's viewership seems to have dropped by in the neighborhood of 90%. But if you want to encounter the true nut jobs, go peruse Twitter for a bit. But it isn't just Twitter. YouTube and Facebook have formally abandoned any pretense of supporting free speech or political impartiality. This is a huge problem because we now have essentially a monopoly on a form of communication that doesn't believe in free speech, but does believe in censorship. And alas, race is tied into that. And moreover, so is protection from liability. Another thing that must be done is that these platforms must be either forced to allow free speech, have their liability protections be removed, or be shut down entirely. For all the good that they could theoretically do, and in some cases may actually do, they are on the balance more a problem than a solution. Most content is neutral, but where it counts, more harm is done than good. 1,000 minor taps upon the wedge each day, and precious little to soften the blows. You know, the more I say this, the more I type it, for originally I had typed this out and I'm reading it, the more depressed I become. So what can you as a person do? Well, disabling your Twitter account would be a start. If you see yourself as white, as black, as Asian, Wipe that distinction from your mind. If you were a citizen of this country, try to see yourself as an American. And do your best to think of everybody else that way too. Treat everybody equally. Your thoughts in the privacy of your own head need not run along those lines, if you must be honest with yourself. But if so, those thoughts need never be shown by your actions. Do not support any organization, initiative, or anything else that recognizes skin color. For instance, anybody who needs to have a color in front of phrases like "lives matter" is promoting division, not unity, if not outright promoting racism. If someone tells you someone you don't know is your enemy because they think differently from you, or if someone makes blanket statements about groups of strangers based on skin color, politics, anything at all, ignore them. It doesn't matter who they are, ignore them. Or at least, if this is impractical or impossible, accept as a given that what they have just said is probably wrong when applied to individuals, because it almost certainly is. Use your own judgment. Follow your conscience. Think about your words and actions. And if you find yourself in a position to make a difference, perhaps as a police officer, a politician, a CEO, any leadership position, while you can't force people to make choices you think are right in their private lives, do what you can to make a difference. But remember the tyrant's lesson. Force creates resistance. Measure for measure. Show people a better way. Do not force them to take it. Bless you all.